Let's just pivot on the back of that to the corporate environment, and then maybe go more into the financial services as well. So, with these changes that are going through, and I know your answer is going to be complex. I've got that now. We're seeing a huge movement being driven by actually quite well-known, leaders. Take BlackRock, for example, where they're pushing this conscious capitalism, ideal, where they're saying, at the end of the day, you're not going to have stewardship and sustainability of your organization unless you have organizations which are a lot more focused towards sustainable issues, sustainable development goals, carbon reduction, which sort of flies in the face of our history, where companies could have all sorts of negative externalities and there was no penalization, for it. And he's kind of suggesting that there's a new type of leadership and a new type of organization that's needed. Do you think that this is true, and are we starting to see this new type of organization develop?
It's definitely true. I mean, it's definitely true that, in the United States, just as much as in South Africa or in Europe, raw capitalism that is unmitigated, driven solely for shareholder benefit, is unsustainable. Let's just put it in that sort of way. That we've seen in countries like South Africa, that it is the business of business to create the conditions of business. And when conditions of business are an environmental question, so what environment do we create for societies, for our communities, for economic growth, for the political environment? And we have to have a total view. Now, I think that there are limits as to, from for example, a US perspective, how those changes, I was going to say tinkering with capitalism, is operating. And I think the German model, the German co-determination model, is very interesting for South Africa, because what that co-determination model does is it takes all employees, including through their trade unions representatives, into the decision-making about the operations of those enterprises through the co-determination model. So you have unions represented on the boards, you have employees with stakes, employee share ownership positions, and it feels far more fundamentally driven, whereas our empowerment strategies in South Africa have been rather shallow and limited and experimental. And I think the reality is coming home that unless we give people a stake in the businesses themselves, there will continue to be a them and us. It's like the public sector unions in South Africa, basically saying, we're going to ask for 3% over inflation, wage increases when we know the balance sheet of the state can't afford it. And yet we don't want to be measured in terms of the production that we is associated with that income. So, we just want the state to pay. We don't want the state to behave as an employer. So, these things cannot survive. You can't survive as capitalists in the world by just crowding out and ignoring your stakeholders. And you cannot survive as a union in a place like South Africa's government by trying to ignore the financial and fiscal imperatives that are real constraints. So, that era when you had Cyril Ramaphosa as Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers and Bobby Godsell as the head of Human Resources at Anglo American, coming to terms with how they were going to deal with the strike in Anglo in the late 80s. That era of co-determination, and really from a realization that they both needed each other, coming to terms in a creative way. Those sorts of leadership examples, I think, is what we need to look to for inspiration now.
Do you think we're going to see a natural move where you see CEOs looking for purpose more? Again, that's another shareholder letter that Finn has sent out and started to promulgate, where he said, and I guess the idea behind this is create a purpose, create something which is not altruistic, but you're just genuinely trying to offer value to your customers or society at large, and your profits will actually come as a byproduct of it, where a lot of organizations are kind of profit-led and they say, we're going to make this margin and pay this dividend over the next couple of years, and they try to go and build around that. Do you think that well, firstly, do you think that's actually an accurate statement that purposeful organizations can outperform? And whatever your answer is, are we going to see a movement towards that to some degree naturally, or are we going to need some structural change?
I mean, I think that in a way is the beauty of capitalism, is that the capitalist system does provide for the mobilization of resources, both financial and people resources, into market vacuums. I mean, I always, I don't know if people have seen Jack Dorsey talk about how his business was created, or the Uber creation, being on the Paris streets, not being able to get a cab, getting frustrated, saying, why can't I just have something on my phone where I call a vehicle, and that creating Uber, because it was fulfilling an immediate need. Now, if you think of all the needs in the world, there are social needs, there are energy needs, there are financial needs, the rise of M-Pesa, the rise of all of these technology solutions, they're all fulfilling a market need. So in that sense, the think, purpose, thought piece is powerful and fits in with how do we mobilize resources to solve societal problems that are not being solved. And of course, you have to have profit.
I'll interrupt on that point, because I think all of those examples are basically, were startups with incredibly passionate founders, and the normal stories about working with garages and borrowing money from your close friends and family, and then 5 to 10 years later, you become an overnight success. So we've got loads of examples of these kind of, Tesla's another example, not quite in the garage, but, we're going to go make sustainable transport, commonplace, and you build up from there. And now everyone knows about Tesla. My question really was more about the existing incumbents. Because if you're a startup and you're naive and you just go and solve this problem, which I think you need to be, you can do incredible things. And on a portfolio basis, there's gazillions of companies out there who try and fail, but a couple, actually make it. So we see the results. Incumbents find it, I think, difficult to follow that type of model. Is that unfair?
No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, the digital phone versus the Polaroids, or the Konicas, those that absolutely got wiped out because they didn't respond to technology advances, versus those that rose, to basically eat the lunch of the incumbents that were too slow to change. But there are the examples of, I always found it very fascinating listening to the likes of the Siemens CEO talk about how they repurposed the whole industrial processing, and the use of robotics and the use of digital information to change the manufacturing and to bring the cost down and make the effectiveness and the efficiency and the product quality improve through their re-engineering of their processes. It's so clearly leadership is about re-engineering and being responsive, and deciding what skills you need and how to repurpose these things and what's obsolete, and recognizing when there is something obsolete. Obviously, the discussion about South African Airways, is it obsolete or not obsolete to have a national airline in a country? Will the tourism industry be served by the rise of a new privately run airline sufficiently to get numbers? It's easy to say, oh no, just close down SAA and let these private airlines rise, but are they going to rise fast enough to service incoming traffic in a post-COVID world? That, and you could apply that to many different sectors, many different situations. The beauty of it is there is a marketplace where if the incumbents don't react fast enough, they will get replaced and they will become obsolete by the new entrants. And then there are, when I say new entrants, I was at Davos in 1997 and I sat next to this person, And I said to him, who are you? He said, I'm Larry. I said, well, what are you here for? He said, no, I've come to receive my Global Leader for Tomorrow reward. I said, what for? He said, no, I've created a new company. It's called Google. So I said, well, what does Google do? This was 1997. So he said, no, it's an information search engine. I said, I'm sorry, Larry, I don't understand. What does that mean? He said, no, imagine if you took all the encyclopedias in the world and you put them online. I said, well, that sounds amazing. So how many people use your encyclopedias? So he said, no, I've got my startup is in my garage in California, but at the moment, about 1 million people use it. And then I woke up, wow, this is something special. But, that Larry Page story of just creating in his garage with Sergey this information search engine to provide as much information online as possible, that vision, that just the impulse of human beings to create is so powerful. And who would have said in 1997 this would be $1 trillion company or whatever it is now, over 1 billion users or however many there are.
How do you think that mindset in the incumbents though? Because I always feel a bit sorry for CEOs that are, thinking in the way of a Larry Page or whoever you want to take as your top founder innovator. They've got shareholders that demand, dividends every year, year in, year out. They've got big investment communities coming through asset managers and analysts and pension funds demanding you operate in a certain way. You've got a board which is, focused on control and, making sure that, and yet all these things seem to constrain them. So if they wanted to step out and to start to try to do something where, if you take Amazon, where you're investing potentially a significant amount of your revenue back into innovation programs, which may or may not succeed, they're almost handcuffed to go and do this. It feels to me like there's a structural issue for them.
I think that's the nature of a maturing organization, right? But they seem to have maintained their innovation, and partly the role of Wall Street has also been to help them think about how do they manage their shareholder relationships, but at the same time create organizations that are investment holding companies that allow capital to go into continued innovation whilst the mothership, the mainstream business, which is Google, continues. They can then create their Google cars or whatever other forms of innovation carry on. And ultimately, I guess there will be those companies that really unbundle, and it'll be, a process of reinvigoration of those companies. And if they don't respond enough, they'll end up being, the dinosaurs that they were started to take on in the first place. So it is I think an ongoing process of evolution.
So you've just taken up a role on the Foschini Group. Is this, I don't know what your sort of mandate and focus points is going to be, but is this something that you'd like to promulgate through to try to go and encourage that type of disruption within that entity, or is that going beyond the role of what a board can actually do?
So it's interesting. I joined the Foschini Group a year ago, so I've been now on the board through that time. And it's my first public company board in the post-Goldman Sachs environment. I am on other boards, but they're not publicly listed companies. And it's been fascinating, a bunch of wise old executives on this board. And it's interesting to see how they operate. And I think it's a very high quality operation. They're a very dynamic CEO in the form of Anthony Turnstrom. And Anthony is constantly looking at innovative ways of reinventing the business, and Michael Lewis, the chairman, supports that entirely. And I think the board, is actively looking at ways in which the whole online business can be accelerated. And they have the leading position. I think it's about 30% of all internet fashion sales is through the Foschini Group, and it's the biggest by a wide margin. But they're not resting on their laurels. They're like very actively thinking about how do they deepen that and accelerate it. And So it's very interesting to see the way a public company board works with its governance and at the same time drive innovation as a company.